So welcome you all to this public event we are organizing as part of the ENTITLE Summer School, organized this week at Bogazici University in the Department of Economics under the theme of Institutions, Justice and Democracy. So the title of the seminar is, as you have seen, Degrowth, Vocabulary for a New Era. So while the term might be new to some of you, there is a growing literature around the idea. And maybe you have seen in the social media very recently, even Pope Francis, in his encyclical letter on care for our common home, took a position as if he was a radical degrowthist. And he says, "We fail to see the deepest roots of our present failures, which have to do with the direction, goals, meaning, and social implications of technological and economic growth." So, let me first introduce you the three distinguished speakers we have here. Giorgos Kallis, Amita Baviskar, and Ashish Kothari. Giorgos will first introduce and elaborate a bit on the idea of degrowth, and then we will have Amita Baviskar and Ashish Kothari as discussants. And then we will open the discussion to the floor. And very briefly, Giorgos Kallis is an environmental scientist working on ecological economics and political ecology. He works as an ICREA research professor at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona, and he is mainly interested in the political economic roots of environmental degradation and its uneven distribution along lines of power, income, class, or race. Amita Baviskar is an associate professor of sociology at the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. Her research focuses on the cultural politics of environment and development. And more recently, she has focused on urban environmental politics, especially bourgeois environmentalism and spatial restructuring in the context of economic liberalization in Delhi. And Ashish Kothari, he is a founder member of Indian environmental group Kalpafrish. Active in both people's movements and on government committees, he has initiated a process to bring together people and stories on alternatives in India and networking on well-being alternatives around the world through a People's Sustainability Treaty on Radical Ecological Democracy. So welcome and thank you for being here. The floor is Giorgos.
Thank you, Begum, and thank you for inviting us to present our book, and thank you also for hosting this wonderful summer school for the whole of this week. The room is a little bit intimidating, and having to talk in front of such an imposing landscape, but there's a tradition of degrowth conferences and speeches taking place in very imposing rooms. The first one I heard, it was in 2002 in Lyon, in some old kind of palace that was like, I don't know how many 100 years old. It's a sign, yes, where now the Pope is with us, so there are different signs. The second conference took place in Barcelona, and I was happy to be there. It was 2010. Again, it was in the auditorium of the University of Barcelona, which is full of paintings also from 16th century. 1,000 people staying there in nice carpets, etc., talking about the growth. And the other one was, I remember, in Venice, which was the third conference, and then Serge Latouche and some spiritual leaders had a meeting inside the Catholic Church with candles and everything. I didn't attend this one, but I heard about it. So there is a tradition, and it's good that we keep up with it. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what is the book, but along the ways of presenting the book, making my case for the growth. So how do I make the case that we need to talk about the growth? And we have to understand the growth in two ways. It's first of all, it's a relentless critique of the idea, or someone might say the ideology of economic growth on a first round. And on the second, it's an opening up of alternatives, of thinking outside the box of how we might prosper without growth. I like a metaphor from a science fiction writer, Ursula Le Guin, that she wrote in the 1970s. And she wrote about her novel. It's called The Dispossessed, so it was a novel about a fantastic planet in the future. And she said, the intention of my novel is to put a pig in the tracks of a one-way future consisting only of growth. And although she didn't know anything about degrowth, I think this captures pretty well the definition of what degrowth is about. So it's first of all, to put a pig in the tracks, stop and start thinking about why do we need to go in this train line of growth, and then open up the discussion of alternatives. So if we don't go in these railways, what other options, what other paths there are? Walking paths or donkey paths or car paths or different paths other than this railway of growth. The way we organize the book, there is, as Begum said, there is a growing debate around the growth, oxymoron. This debate has taken place in conferences. We have had the last conference in Leipzig a few months ago, and we had 3,000 attendants there. There are more and more academics who are engaging in the debate to criticize it, to engage to it, to contribute to it. And there is no consistent single line of this is what the thesis of degrowth is. So we are not purporting to present a theory, as is the theory of economic growth, for example, in economics. No, we are not purporting to propose a theory of economic degrowth. Again, that would be an oxymoron. No, the point is not to propose a theory of how the economy can go reversely, but to think, as I said, outside of the one-way future consisting only of growth. And this thinking has different roots and takes different directions. So the way we thought with my friends in Barcelona to present these roots was in the form of a vocabulary. So to collect the keywords that people are using when they talk about degrowth and bring them together and connect one to the other. So we made the vocabulary with short entries with keywords that they are key to the degrowth debates. And then we have cross-references from one keyword to the other one. Someone pointed this to me that I hadn't pointed out, but our cover is a garden. And somehow the way we have structured the book is like a garden of ideas rather than a single idea. So the first part of the book is on the different lines of thought that have influenced the degrowth debates. And there are different lines of thought, and I don't want to go over them. I want to tease you a little bit so that you buy the book or download it. But there are many entry points through different people are coming to degrowth. Just to give an example, some anthropologists are coming through a critique of utilitarianism and the idea that the only exchange that takes place between humans is market exchange. They have, for example, shown the historical importance of gift exchange in older societies, but also continuing in our societies. But I'm not going to take this line of thinking today. So I want to be kind to my hosts, and since I'm hosted by an economics department, I'm going to follow a little bit of an economic language today, and economic symbols, numbers, graphs, x, y axes, etc., and present a little bit the case for degrowth. But what I want to make clear is that this is not the only language or the only way that many people are coming to degrowth. So it's not an economics or economistic only theory, but it's one with which different disciplines are coming together. I'm going to present a little bit the economic part of it, but then I'm opening the discussion to open up into the other lines of thought. And what I wanted to say also is that the way we have thought the book is that each reader can make their own story of how they see degrowth. So the story you're going to hear now is my own story. I'm not sure even if my co-editors will agree with that, but you can try your own story when you read the book. So what's my argument in a nutshell? So first of all, I'm going to argue that growth has become uneconomic. So economic growth no longer exists. We have growth, but it is uneconomic, and it is harder to get in developed countries. My presentation will refer to developed countries. So by this, very largely speaking, I refer to OECD countries. I will argue that growth is still pursued at all costs, like we hear that Greece needs growth, Spain needs growth, the US needs growth, how much did the UK grow this year, etc. Because, why is this happening? I'm going to argue because without growth, the capitalist system and those who profit from it are not able to function. And that's an important thing. I'm not saying it only as a criticism to capitalism. I'm saying it as a recognition that without growth in the current economies that we have serious problems. We have unemployment, we had escalating debts, etc. So these are not problems to be underestimated. They are serious things, and they are very serious, more so since I'm from Greece. Then I'm going to move to the prognosis. So first I've put the pig on the tracks, and then I'm looking at the alternatives. So I'm going to argue that there are alternatives for prospering without growth, and then I'm going to argue very briefly that their realizations requires transformative political change. So it's not that we lack the ideas, but we still do not have the politics at place to bring these ideas forward. But I think there are hopeful signs that this politics might be emerging, at least in some places. So the diagnosis. And I said I'm going to use axes. The x-axis is the horizontal one, the y is the vertical. And when you see number in the horizontal, it means a year. No, I'm joking, but many of us are social scientists, so graphs might put off some immediately, and I don't want to put you off. I want you to follow the graphs, okay? So what the blue line is showing is the GDP, the change of GDP. It's in Finland, but it could be any other country. I chose Finland because the data there is more reliable, but these same calculations have been done for other countries. The blue line is the GDP, and the red line and the orange line are alternative indicators of measuring welfare, because GDP does not measure welfare. This much also very mainstream economists like Joseph Stiglitz, the Sarkozy report, have accepted that GDP does not measure welfare. It's a sign of the business of the economy, how much we exchange with one another and what value this has. But if we measure welfare differently, for example, by the genuine progress indicator, or by the index of sustainable economic welfare, which subtracts costs, does not count if we build a prison or if we clean a spill-off in a river, this doesn't count as growth, this counts as negative, okay? They try to count the negatives differently and have clean indicators of welfare. We can see that for Finland, for example, since the 1980s, we don't have any progress in welfare. These similar calculations have been made for the US, for the UK, for many other countries, and you find similar results. So this is to support my argument that growth has become uneconomic, so it doesn't produce more good than bad. The second indicator that we have that growth has become uneconomic is that growth does not increase happiness, our personal satisfaction of life. You might argue whether this is a valid goal or if it's a valid indicator, but I think it's important to see that in a country like the US, the number of people who, when interviewed, they declare themselves as very happy, has remained the same despite 40 years of spectacular economic growth. So one question here is like, if growth does not increase the well-being of people, the way they perceive it, then what's the purpose of it? There are, of course, different studies that contest this argument, etc., but I think the most recent and most definitive study on that, which is by Easterlin and his colleagues, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, basically find the same. They find that if you take the long term, and just 1 year by the other, but if you take a 10-year period and you see how much a country has grown up on average these 10 years, and you see also how much satisfaction by life or by the economic situation of people has changed, you basically do not find any change. Easterlin, this was called the Easterlin paradox, but basically what Easterlin argued is that what happens is that when a country grows, two things happen. Either our expectations adjust, no? We get richer, but then we say like, okay, we already have that, we would like to have something more, no? Or what happens is, more or less we grow together economically, but what gives relative satisfaction, financial, economic satisfaction, or personal satisfaction, are positional comparisons. So if somebody asks me, are you satisfied with the money that you have right now, with your salary? You always compare yourself. There's not an absolute number. So your salary increases, the salary of the other one increases. More or less what you can buy, but also what you desire changes also, and you don't get any better along this process. So that's also another big blow on the idea that economic growth is necessary for improving welfare. But of course, for us who come from environmental scientists, a very important finding is that economic growth is directly related to carbon emissions, which are causing a huge problem, as we know, with climate change. And I'm focusing here on climate change. Someone might say that's not the only environmental problem. I will fully agree, but I take it as an indicator of also many other global environmental pressures, from pressures to ecosystems, to pressure to nitrogen cycles, etc. So there is a long literature which shows that economic growth and material extraction on carbon emissions, they go directly one-to-one related. This is not such a radical statement these days, no? Like Naomi Klein said it a few months ago, and she said, like, this changes everything. She said, if we have to seriously think about climate change, this changes everything. We cannot longer think about economic growth as the goal as we were thinking up to now. But now it's not only Naomi Klein, it's the Pope also saying exactly the same in his statement. So, I mean, when I was coming here, I thought I would be treated as a radical. Now I'm afraid I'm going to be treated as a conservative. But this shows that there is a certain common sense and an accumulating evidence for what we are saying. So it's not like just a few marginal people making crazy ecological arguments out there. This graph, which I did with a student of mine, I'm going to refer to the work later again. I mean, it's a very basic graph, but what you can see is that when the only times that carbon emissions fall, which is the blue line, is also when GDP falls. I'm not saying something to get a Nobel Prize here. I mean, it's obvious, but it's very often forgotten. Of course, to see that these two lines go together does not mean that there is a correlation, no? Or that there is a causation. There is a correlation, but you might argue that there is no causation between the two. So it might be that when oil prices go up, then you have both carbon emissions reducing and the economy going down, no? So what we did what we are doing actually, it's a work in progress with a student of mine in Barcelona, PhD student, Sao King Long, is we are trying to run a more rigorous econometric analysis and to see which are the main factors that they affect the degree to which an economy decarbonizes, which means reduces its carbon emissions. So economists will get this table quickly. The others don't try to get it, just focus on the red circle. And the red circle, basically what it says is that the effect of a recession on carbon emissions is more or less a 6.6% reduction. And this is unlike anything else that has been proposed as a measure for reducing carbon emissions. Like people have talked about investing in renewable energy capacity, about technological innovation, about policy. The only factor that is statistically significant related to a reduction of carbon emissions, and by a large effect of 6% reductions, is recession. Am I celebrating recession? No, I'm not. But what I'm showing is that there is a clear argument there that the only thing that can reduce carbon emissions and many other environmental pressures that make growth uneconomic is a reduction in the scale of production and consumption, the scale of the economy. Okay, from Piketty though, and many others, but Piketty I think made it quite clear in his work, and I found amazing I think it's his second or third chapter in his book. He makes clear that it's not only that, but that growth is coming on its own into a stagnating phase. There are economists who are talking about a secular stagnation, that the economy cannot grow even if we pump it with money like crazy, like we get the interest rates negative, still the economy refuses to react to that. And Piketty argued that that shouldn't surprise us, like the history of the economy and the history of the economic history has been one of very low growth rates. So the low growth have been 0 to 1%, slightly higher in the 50s to 80s, which was the 30 glorious years, as he calls them, from France. So we got like a per capita 2.5, no, the 2 to 3% growth rate that is very often referred to as the healthy growth rate for an economy, 3.4 in Europe. And then we start going again down. Like now we are in 1.7 for the world, 1.8 for Europe, 1.3 for America, and it's getting lower. So the economy is stagnating on its own. It's not only that it's becoming uneconomic, but it's also stagnating. And incomes for sure have stagnated. And this is from the work of Joseph Stiglitz. I went to a presentation by him, and I was surprised to see this graph and be like really confronted with it, that basically the median income, not the average income, the median income, the income that any of us can have in here, not if we take the rich and the poor and we divide by our number. The median income in a country like the US has more or less been stagnant since the 1970s, despite the increase of growth, despite the increase in GDP. Incomes have stagnated, growth has stagnated, but incomes have stagnated more than GDP. What does this mean? It means that growth sustains the profits of the few. So if median incomes have stagnated, it means that it's the ones on the top that they are getting most of this growth. This is again from the work of Size and Piketty. It's the top. It's a percentage of the total income that goes to the top 1% of the population. Again for the US. Okay, and you see, it was very high in the 30s, another glorious period, no? It fell down in the 50s and 60s, and now again it is increasing, the percentage that goes to the top 1%. If you put also a similar graph about the share of income that goes to capital versus the share of income that goes to salaries, you'll see a very, very similar graph. I'm not putting it, but consider it's exactly the same picture. So we have a picture of stagnation of incomes, slow stagnating growth, and more of this income going to the rich. So we know from economics and from Keynesian economics that if you have stagnating incomes for the majority of the people, then you don't have demand to buy the extra things that they are produced with the increasing GDP. So then the question becomes, how do you secure this little growth to continue in this period? And what we know is that since the 70s, this stagnating growth has been sustained by increasing levels of borrowing and lending. I'm angry with those that accuse only Greece for over-borrowing, because what happened in Greece is that basically because our economy is very state-centered, we borrowed through the government. Let's say demand was maintained through the extra spending and borrowing of the government. But in the majority of other countries, like here we see the US, borrowing mostly went through the private sector and through extra lending by the banks. And here the red line is the percentage of debt to GDP. The red line is the percentage of private debt in the US to GDP. As you see, it skyrockets after the 70s. So more and more people are borrowing from the banks to maintain a level of consumption necessary for growth, but a level of consumption that does not have an equivalence to their incomes, which have stagnated. So the crisis that we are facing now is very clear where it's coming from. Someone might say that the lending has different reasons. So one reason was the very low interest rates that the US government had, so you could borrow money very easily. But others are saying that these very low interest rates, sorry if I'm putting too much economic jargon for my sociologist friends, but the very low interest rates had to do with the flows of capital that they were coming to the US, mostly from China and from the Arab world. And I think from the Arab world it's quite interesting because I assume this is what's happening to Turkey also now. And also it's directly related to oil. So why there were a lot of surpluses and money accumulated in the oil world, it was because we consume oil and because the price of oil was going up. So there were more and more profits there going to the US, suppressing interest rates there and making lending very easy. What did this cause? It caused bubbles. And this is the price of houses compared to disposable income. Red line is US, blue line is Spain, the worst case scenario in terms of housing bubbles. And the rest is history. I mean, this is the beginning of the crisis. So to recap my argument, we have an otherwise growth that would otherwise be stagnating, sustained fictitiously by high debts and by bubbles. And this growth mostly is taking place to sustain the incomes of the 1%. I'm being populist here, but okay, we can discuss if it's the 1%, the 0.1, if it's the capital, okay, but you get the point. While degrading the livelihoods and environments of the rest, without any positive effect on well-being. So happiness is not increasing, welfare is not increasing, all this is being done to sustain certain privileged positions. And I think this story might be a little bit simplistic, but it plays out, I see it playing out in Greece, and with a very little I know of Turkey, I can say that it might be playing out here too, that you have an influx of capital flows that it's very difficult to say no to, no? Who would say no to all this money coming from the Arab world or from accumulating surpluses everywhere? They are pushing and they are propelling a growth, but this is a growth that doesn't reflect an improvement in the living standards of the majority of the people. And at the same time, this growth is becoming uneconomic. It's destroying environments. These days we are here, we're constantly hearing stories about this bridge is passing here, this road is passing there, this airport is coming there, not really knowing why, no. It's coming because money is coming, it's causing growth, and this thing is moving. Like in Spain, we have the so-called ghost airports, no? There were all these airports that they were built, and now no one flies there. And this was because the money was coming, growth was happening. Spain was a tiger, everyone was happy. When I arrived there, everyone was dancing, like here in Istanbul. Then things changed. So someone might say that with the same story, though, I could make a different argument. How am I doing in terms of time? I have 7 minutes left? Okay, that's not bad. Someone might say with the same data and evidence that I provided, make a very different argument. They could say, yes, that's true. growth has been bad up to now. It hasn't been translated into the incomes of people. So what we need to have is an inclusive growth that spreads better among people, and also that it becomes green, that it leads us to a transition that will avoid the climate change problem. So they say we don't need degrowth, we need growth. We still need growth. So one question is like, okay, why do we still need growth if this doesn't increase welfare, doesn't increase happiness, if we know that any number like perpetual cumulative growth leads to infinity, so we know that at some point this thing is going to end, but still we need growth because otherwise the system will collapse, will become like Greece, etc. So there is an argument to be made there. Our counter-argument in this book is that this idea of an inclusive green growth is probably very unlikely. I wouldn't say that it's theoretically impossible, or I wouldn't say that I have the data to prove that it's impossible, but I would say it's unlikely. First of all, the green part is very unlikely. What we often, the idea of green growth is that you can have continuous economic growth, but reduced carbon emissions. This is called decoupling in our, dematerialization in our jargon. We say that this is impossible for two reasons. One term we use is Jevons paradox. This is the idea that many people are saying, okay, we can reduce emissions and still grow by becoming more efficient, by developing more efficient energy technologies, by using resources more efficiently. The Jevons paradox is the idea is that the more efficient you become, the more resources you use, because resources become cheaper. It's basically the fundamental idea of economic growth. No? The more productive you get, the better is your productivity, the more you grow. The more surpluses you have, you investment, you grow more. So what we are saying in degrowth is that by becoming more efficient, we're not reducing carbon emissions, we increase the economy, so we emit more, and this is what has happened up to now. We have much more efficient cars or technologies than 20 or 30 years ago, but we emit more carbon. And the second argument that we have against this idea of a green growth is many people are saying, okay, we could move to a service economy, no? Where we give massages to one another, we read Kindles, we just play in the beach now, and that's the economy. So, I mean, you can understand that it's a little bit strange idea that this can create 3% growth every year in income, etc., and not bridges or airports and things like that. So I think it's unlikely by that. But another thing that ecological economists are saying is the idea of emergy. Emergy, and I'm not misspelling there, it's the embodied energy of things, the embodied energy of services. So services like Kindle have embodied energy. They have the energy that went to produce the Kindle, to take out the resources that went into the Kindle, to train the researchers like us that they were sitting in rooms like this discussing about how they will design Kindle, etc. So all these things have embodied energy. And it's very unlikely to imagine a service economy that will run with very little energy or reducing energy. So first argument against green growth. Second argument against growth, because growth is harder and harder to get, especially in the developed world that I'm talking about, developed countries, sorry. And we have two options now for growth. The one is austerity, which further suppresses stagnating wages. So it's what's happening in Greece right now, and it's obviously not going anywhere. Or we have the idea of Keynesians, which is more debt, so more of the same of what was happening before. I dislike to be sometimes against Keynesians, but I have to, because I don't think also that their proposal is that promising, you know, to emit more and more debt, and that this somehow will kickstart the economy, because this is what happened in the 30s. Yes, this happened in the 30s, but we are not in the 30s anymore, so I'm not so sure that the strategy is working. But sometimes politically I prefer them to the Austerians for obvious reasons, no? At least with the Keynesians you might have 1 or 2 years of better life before you collapse, no? With the Austerians is right now. Another point that we have is like pursuing green technologies, like renewable energies, for example, or investing in, or redistributing the wealth, having policies that they are redistributive, or investing in things that we really care about, like health, education. I have the suspicion, I cannot prove it, but because in a certain ways this reduce productivity rather than increase productivity, they further suppress growth rates. So the nice things to do, the right things that we have to do now, it might be that economists are right that sometimes they are against growth. But for the growthers like us, this is fine, you know. As long as we don't care about growth, but we care about welfare and the right things, why not invest in things even if they have a negative effect on growth? So, I know that the evidence I provide for this is, can be read in many different ways. Some people might say, no, we can invest in renewables, the cost is going to be little, we can redistribute wealth, and this will be better for growth, etc. So there are different arguments there, and we say that we are willing to be agnostic, like let's do the right things in a way, let's say, and then if this causes growth, which I highly doubt it would be fine. But degrowth, first and foremost, is a rejection of this obsession with growth. So it's like, let's do the right things and forget about growth. More than likely, this will force us to find ways to prosper without growth. If we are right, that if our hypothesis is right, that if we do the right things, this will force us to live with a smaller economy, an economy that runs slower, that produces less output. So the key question then becomes, Tim Jackson in his book, Prosperity Without Growth, put it pretty nicely. He said, growth is unsustainable, but the growth is unstable within a capitalist economy, I might add, or within an economy that can only grow or die. So is prosperity without growth possible? This is an elephant that becomes a snail, so it is possible. That's the proof. So then it's not possible because an elephant has never become a snail, but it's okay. It can become with the hand of a painter, so it can become with our thoughts, no? So how do we think in this book that the growth can become prosperous, or we can prosper without growth? So we are talking about a threefold post-capitalist transformation. So first of all, we find hope in grassroots and everyday transformations, new types of economies that they exist and they emerge in contexts of crisis. So we heard today in our summer school about the work of Gibson Graham on community economies, different types of economies that are not necessarily the standard capitalistic form of economy, cooperatives, exchange networks, alternative food networks, urban gardens, different ways of producing and consuming where people self-organize at a lower level and they create different alternative economies. This takes place under the name of the commons. It's called the commons because people are coming together and they are pooling common resources together and they share them and they develop ways of sharing these resources. And networks of care, where we care for one another and we care for the reproduction of our commons. So these alone, of course, someone would say they are marginal, they are avant-gardist, they cannot change the big picture alone. And of course, the big pictures in many ways goes against them. So if you try to do a cooperative right now in the current conditions in Greece, things are against you, from the way the social security system works, from the way the whole economy works, etc., from the way the laws are designed, etc. So at the same time, we need action to change institutions, economic institutions and political institutions at a broader level. I put it simply here, but we can put it in different terms. We need institutions that decouple well-being from growth. Right now, to have employment and jobs, we need growth. To pay off debts, we need growth. 3 minutes? The time passes slowly, or Begum is very kind with me. So how do we do it? And here there are interesting ideas coming out from economists. Alternative economists or ecological economists. There is the idea of a basic income, a basic citizens' income granted to everyone out of the public budget. There is the idea of work sharing, which means we reduce working hours rather than increase them, which is the austerity approach. We reduce working hours so that there is more work available for people. There is the counter-argument there that we are becoming less productive. Yes, less productive though means under certain conditions more jobs. So it's a circuit where we try to change the welfare and the work policies in a way that we can have employment or we can have a basic level of sustenance without requiring growth. There is the idea of public money by Mary Mellor. I'm not going to go into details, but it's her idea of the public sector retaking the control of the issuing of financing and money from private banks. And of course, there is the idea of, we ecological economists promote a lot, which is the idea of caps, carbon caps and taxes, which means the idea that we put an absolute limit, no matter what, on the amount of carbon emissions we can emit, the amount of material resources we can draw, and then we adjust the economy within this given through taxes or through other policies, rather than try to do the right things and then see what this will mean in terms of carbon emissions, because this we know it doesn't work. So it's the other way around. Put the cap, have a cap that is decreasing, and then see what is going to happen in the economy and adjust the economy to this situation, rather than go the other way around. Of course, these things are way out there, no? They are way out of what's the mainstream right now politically and in terms of power in different countries. So for all this to happen, we argue in the book, there is a need for political organizing. So there is a need for political organizing both to protect the new forms of commons that they are emerging, but also to bring forward these institutions that they will be conducive to the flourishing of these new commons, and they will secure welfare without growth. We see a lot of this political organizing, perhaps we don't see a lot of the political results. There aren't political parties, I would say, or political forces that per se are arguing for degrowth or per se are following this vision. But there are, I think, interesting things happening. There are, for example, in Greece or in Spain, we see a move away from, in Greece less so, but the situation is also much more restrictive there. We see a move away from this discourse of monomania with economic growth. So, for example, the left party now in Spain, Podemos, is slowly distancing itself from the discourse of growth. And, for example, in Barcelona, we have a new mayor that today I read in the news, the current Minister of Environment accused her as being of the party of degrowth. And we said, great, you know, good, we voted for you. We sensed you were the party of degrowth. He used it as a derogative term, but for us it's a positive term. And if it becomes a positive term for her voters, then we are going somewhere. But in a way, she is the party of degrowth. She didn't talk about degrowth, but she didn't talk about growth at all. So nowhere in the manifesto of the political party that will govern the city of Barcelona, you would find the word growth. And they didn't have a single committee that was dealt with the economy. So the economy was integrated in different areas, like social inclusion, environment, etc. So it's a reversal of the logic, and this is precisely what we are arguing for. So this is the part of the book, part 3, where we focus on these ideas for the future, alternative economies, alternative institutions, and alternative political formations. And the last part of the book deals with the most difficult question that some of you will ask me. No? You will tell me, okay, this might be good. You might get me and agree with you if you talk about the US or the UK or the rich part of the world. But what about the other part of the world that still needs to grow? We argue in the book that we have to leave this mentality. And we take distance from the discourse even of the Pope. So we are atheists here. We take discourse even from the discourse of the Pope, who says the rich world has to degrow so that the poor world has to grow. We are saying the rich world has to degrow so that the poor world can decide what it wants to do, you know. It's not, we don't want to reproduce this mentality of growth, precisely because this definition of rich and poor is always relative. Right now, Greeks are feeling poor, there are poor people in Great Britain, etc. So the discourse will always remain a relative one. What we want to do is exactly challenge the idea of growth and then open up the discussion of alternatives. And that's how we close the book, by bringing in alternative discourses from different parts of the world. So we don't envisage the growth as a new colonial idea that will replace growth and then will go to different contexts and be implemented. What we are envisaging is a critique that might travel around. And in all countries, it's a difficult critique. If I say degrowth in Greek, they tell me, oh, the word doesn't work. The same is in India, the same I hear is in Latin America. In England, they told us that the word is awful and ugly. But now someone wrote in The Guardian, it's a very cute word, so it takes time for people to see the cuteness in degrowth. So the idea is to break up this idea of growth, criticize it, and then open up the room for alternatives in the rest of the world. So I'm happy that the two commentators to our book today are from India, so they can tell us what this looks from their perspective, and I hope it doesn't look like bourgeois environmentalism. Okay, all right.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. It was great to get a sense of the book and to get it in such a sort of lucid and witty way. Since I'm here as an Indian, I should begin by quoting Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi said that God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization after the manner of the West. The economic imperialism of a single tiny island, by which he meant Great Britain, is today keeping the world in chains. If our nation took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts. So Gandhi was an early prophet of the idea of degrowth. And it's good to remember that as we think of more recent sort of diagnosis of this pathology of political economy. For instance, a 2009 report by Rockstrom and Will Steffen that talks about planetary boundaries and the way in which what might be thought of as a safe operating space for humanity has been violated in no less than 3 different spheres: climate change, biodiversity loss, as well as the biogeochemical environment. So this book, which squarely focuses on the relationship between economy and society and ecology, is to be welcomed because what it does is to challenge the ideology of growth and the dominance of an economic system premised on growth, which is the common sense of our times and which is the context in which we are embedded. And anything which destabilizes that, anything which denaturalizes that is really to be appreciated. The idea of degrowth can radically reset our understanding of the world, and when put into practice, it can overturn the power relations that anchor social and ecological injustice. And the way the book's organized with very clear systematic entries, which represent a diversity of thought around issues, around keywords associated with the idea of degrowth, is very valuable as a way of giving us many ideas that are very good to think with. I have one question, which is a bit of a quibble perhaps, but given how closely the growth imperative is part of the genetic code of capitalism, of accumulation and expansion based on commodity fetishism and mass consumerism, why focus on growth, which is only one aspect of capitalism, and not sort of name the beast itself? I mean, why not talk about, for instance, capitalism in the form of a military-industrial complex? When I skimmed the book, I didn't see any entry for militarism and war, but I would think that that's an absolutely essential aspect of what drives growth. So I wondered why degrowth as opposed to, getting rid of capitalism. But when reading the book, I was also struck by a strong sense of déjà vu. Many of you might be too young to remember, but there's a strong echo here of the 1970s debates around the idea of development, around the idea of new social movements. And we see that there's some certain sort of echoes between that time and the present one. In the early 1970s, there's an oil crisis. We see economic inflation, the Vietnam War, and so on, which in turn sort of becomes a turbulent period where there's a crisis of meaning in the sense of what political economy is all about, what society is all about, and so on. And we see the rise of student movements around peace, around women's issues, around the environment, and so on. And these new social movements, because they're a departure from older forms of working class, so-called red politics, get called a new grammar of politics. And in many ways, I think the same sort of claims about a radical break and a disjuncture with past politics can be seen in claims about degrowth and how this is going to be revolutionary in a way that's never been imagined before. One critique which applied to that time and which might apply to this one, might I say, so this is a polite question and not I haven't read the whole book, so I can't sort of formulate it with more definitiveness. is that at that time at least, the new social movements were quite inward looking. One thinks of Europe and North America. I mean, there was a certain amount of navel gazing going on in the sense that they dealt with northern and the anxieties of the global north. Decolonization was there as an issue, but for the most part it was muted. It was not a major part of what was being discussed as, as ideas which would transform the world. And I want to just raise this as a question. Could the present discussion around degrowth also have a similar blind spot in the sense of not thinking through colonialism and post-colonialism? I'm going to come back to this issue in a minute. At that time, there was a critique of the idea of development, maybe a little later, late 1970s, early 1980s. And the present book, in the introduction, the co-editors also are critical of development, especially the way in which the idea of development has been posed as sustainable development, as a win-win solution to sort of the marriage of welfare with ecological concern. And I agree with much of that critique about development. And in a way, the fact that this book is organized around keywords reminded me of Wolfgang Sachs' Development Dictionary, which also adopted the same device. And I think that that this book is quite right, and the authors are right to point to the depoliticizing tendency of development as a concept, and of the institutions, aid agencies, governments, etc., that it works through. What Jim Ferguson called the anti-politics machine, which takes very serious political and economic problems and renders them into technical and managerial issues, which can be solved by, as Escobar reminds us, experts, usually white, usually male, and usually from the very countries that colonized large parts of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and gave us the problem of the lack of development to start with. But the same sort of critique that people like Escobar and Ferguson and others, including this book's co-editors, bring to the concept of development should, I think, be extended to all sorts of concepts, especially when they emerge from the global north. So what politics does the discourse of degrowth, or for that matter, another current concept, the Anthropocene, authorize? And, as these concepts travel around the world, take on a certain currency, they also then suggest certain agendas, certain forms of action. And the ways in which these conversations happen is, I think, important in terms of, who's diagnosing the problem, who's then prescribing what should be done for it. The Anthropocene, as has been now, it's now sort of a common critique of it, should more accurately be called the Anglocene. And the people who sort of name the problem are the ones responsible for causing it. Now, can the same charge be applied to the idea of degrowth? Before we discard development, let's remember that it's still a key word for people who strive to live with a degree of material comfort, with dignity, and with some amount of control over their lives. And the word development still speaks to their desire to realize their potential, to be human, to be curious or creative or compassionate. And that vision of development for large parts of the world still requires growth. Certainly a different metabolism of growth from the kind that capitalism forces down our throats, perhaps, but growth nevertheless. And to argue that this growth can happen just by straightforward redistribution of resources is not enough. And when I think of the ways in which social movements in the global south, be it environmental justice movements in the US or be they somewhere else in the world, in Asia, Africa, etc., where social movements have fought against forms of capitalist extraction and accumulation, they've often embraced the term development. And they've tried to redefine it in ways that make sense to them. And they've tried to create alternatives that actually speak to that larger universal vision that development promises, but that capitalism fails to deliver on. So I think it's a bit premature to write the obituary of the word development and to suggest that it be substituted by degrowth, because I think it's still a key word. There's still a lot of it still resonates a lot with people's aspirations and their ideas for bringing about a better world. So I have to therefore ask that if development, if growth as a process exploits and excludes, what does the concept of degrowth leave out? Who does it leave out? And who decides what's going to be growth and what's going to be degrowth? Who speaks for whom? Finally, I'll end with a practical question. How? In the morning, we heard about different initiatives, about different forms of property ownership and finance and work and so on. But the politics of bringing about a more equitable and ecologically just order requires addressing inequalities at different scales. And there's nothing so far that actually suggests that the question of scale is being seriously addressed in the idea of degrowth. By different scales, I mean nation states, regions, the city and the countryside, the local. I mean, what would be the relations between these? And this becomes, I think, an even more important question given that the concept of degrowth is coming out of the global north, where it makes a certain kind of sense. But currently the impetus of growth is in Asia, and that means that you have to have negotiations across these very different contexts, linked though they are. And who participates in this conversation is crucial to deciding the fate of degrowth as an idea and as a practice, and whether it will have the same career as other concepts for saving the world, or whether it will chart a new path. And I am grateful to the authors, to all the contributors to the book, because they've given us a new set of ideas that are good to think with, and that I think open up the conversation in a radically different way. Whether we agree with the concept or not, it is still a good one to engage with. Thank you.
Okay, it's a hard thing to go after those two presentations. I think some of what I'm going to say, a lot of what I'm going to say, of course, builds on what Amita has already said and in agreement with what Giorgos has said. But perhaps there's also some levels of disagreement, which I think might be interesting for the later discussion. Since this is also an opportunity taken by our lead speaker to promote a book, here's ours, which is a detailed critique of what has gone on in the name of growth and development in India over the last few decades, especially the last 2.5 decades of so-called globalized development and growth, where we show in great detail that there is both the state-led project of development and growth, as also the corporate-led, especially in the last couple of decades, the corporate-led capitalist model have created enormous problems, which are fundamental to the models themselves, the models which actually focus significantly on the concentration of political and economic power, whether in the state or in private corporations. Models that assume that the larger the scale of the economic activity, the better it is, or the more developed one is. All kinds of assumptions of how livelihoods and jobs should be created, even the distinction or the division that is made between livelihoods and jobs. So here's an economy that needs to create more and more jobs, while actually it is destroying enormous numbers of traditional lifestyles and livelihoods. Notions of what prosperity is, what is wealth, and of course the assumption of the linearity of development, that one has to go from so-called primitive to agriculture, food collection kind of thing, hunting, etc., to agriculture, to industry, to services, etc. The whole linearity that has come down to us from mainstream economic models. All of this and more are assumptions that have been very much part of the Indian growth and development story, the results of which are fairly clear for those of us who would like to open our eyes and see them, which is, of course, ecological and sustainability on many, many fronts. It's fairly clear. If you travel through the country, you will see that very visibly and very starkly. But even in terms of some recent studies that have shown the kind of impacts, even the economic impacts of the ecological damage that is being created by this model. Growing inequality, as is the case, of course, across the world, but certainly in India you see this again very starkly. You just have to go to Bombay and walk for 10 minutes and you will see it. Especially if you happen to be near the world's biggest house, which is owned by one family, 27 stories, and just under him there's a slum where people have virtually nothing to live on. New forms of injustice and new forms of poverty. If you look at poverty in terms of deprivation from basic needs, not just in terms of $1 or $1.25 a day kind of thing, but deprivation from basic needs that all of us should have access and secure access to, according to us, at least 70% of India is still poor. And in fact, there are new forms of poverty where people who were dependent on who actually had secure access to at least clean water and forest produce and agricultural produce and so on are deprived of that by this model of development where lands and forests and water are taken away. No net new jobs, or very few net new jobs in the last 25 years because mechanization tends to take over and you actually have incredible amounts of layoffs even as new jobs are being created in things like IT sector and automobiles and so on. And of late especially, but growing over the last 2, 3, 4 decades, the erosion of democracy. We see this especially with the current government which is hitting very badly at civil society that is raising questions about this model of development and growth and various things associated with it, especially things like forcible land acquisition. And spaces for civil society are actually declining. So all of this, according to us, is actually an inevitable consequence of this model of growth, and I would add actually also this model of development. The question that arises, and I'd like to spend the next maybe 5-6 minutes looking at what could be the alternatives, or what are the alternatives. And for that, I'm going to turn to, could you just put that on? Sometimes when I don't use PowerPoint, I have this favorite quote from somebody else. I don't actually know who it is from, which says, those who use PowerPoint are the ones who don't have the power to make a point. But since I'm going to use it, I take that sentence back. Okay, so not being as powerful as Amita, who didn't need PowerPoint. Okay, what we see, and this is mostly on the basis of work that's done in India, is that there's an incredible amount of experimentation, initiatives, innovation that is taking place both in rural and in urban India on all the different sectors of life, right? From political to economic to social to ecological to cultural, where people are actually rejecting mainstream methods of so-called development and actually trying to find new ways of human well-being, new ways of organizing themselves, etc. It's fairly similar to the first point I think that Giorgos made about what could be the alternative pathway, which is really about decentralized grassroots initiatives, small scale, big scale, various different scales and various different kinds. I don't have the time to go into it right now, but we do have a number of publications and a website which you can look at for this. What we find in these initiatives is the sort of beginnings of what could be termed as an alternative framework. And this alternative framework is, of course, not just a theoretical construct that some of us have sat in New Delhi and created. It's based on discussions and dialogues with people in these initiatives, with local communities and so on, which has 5 essential pillars or elements. And I'm not going to go into detail here, we don't have the time. But essentially, ecological sustainability is obviously at a very core, at the very base of this. but not to forget social justice and well-being and inequality. And this is something that's really crucial in a country like India, which has incredible amounts of social inequalities built in from the past, and then new ones that, as I said earlier, are emerging. It's based on the notion of not representative democracy, which unfortunately most countries of the world have accepted as being the form of democracy, but actually a much more direct form. And to give you a slogan of one of my favorite examples from central India, where they say that we elect the government in New Delhi and Bombay, but in our village we are the government. Which essentially says that in the place we are sitting, we are going to be the ones taking the decisions, nobody else sitting up there in government or private corporations or whatever. It's also, of course, moving much more towards getting towards producers, whether they're in the farming sector or manufacturing, etc., to be in control of the means of production, in control or at least have a significant say in the market, and so on. Much greater attempt at localization, moving away from globalization, actually, at least for basic needs, to say that within this particular ecological and cultural region, we should be able to meet at least all of our basic needs, over and above which, of course, we should and will continue to have economic exchanges with other regions. And, of course, respect for cultural diversity, which in India, as you know, is one of our biggest assets, but of course there is erosion of cultural diversity through mainstream education systems and advertising and so on. So actually to try and sustain that, celebrate that, and to put knowledge back into the commons with research and development innovation happening not only in expert institutions but actually being generated as part of people's own initiatives. That's a small snapshot of the kinds of things that are emerging, the kind of pillars or essential elements that are emerging from these initiatives, which we have put together in this book in the form of what we call radical ecological democracy. Now that's a label. Of course, all of these things are labels: degrowth, buen vivir, or whatever other, eco-socialism, whatever. These are all labels. So I don't think we should worry so much about the labels. But the essential idea is, and I should point out here that the word radical, which unfortunately a lot of people get scared by, is not about extreme, but it's actually going to the roots. It's a simple notion that people everywhere, wherever they are, in their villages, in their towns, are the ones who are at the core of decision making, and that decision making, which is collective, is based on fundamental ecological principles and principles of social equality and justice. So it's a fairly simple kind of thing, but of course it's complex in the way it is played out in different sectors and different sectors of society and economy and polity. The most crucial element of this, or aspect of this, of course, is that we no longer place faith in either the state or in the private corporation, but actually in the community. And that community can be defined in many different ways. I'm well aware of the fact that community itself is a very contested term, but, and we don't, maybe in the discussion we can go into it, but basically a self-defined collective which can be of various kinds, traditional village, or it could be a new form, it could be university, bunch of students or whatever, but self-defined places where people actually are able to have the control over decision making that they need to have. Let me end the slides by actually listing what I think could be common to these sorts of alternatives and something like degrowth. And then I'll end with just a comment on the word degrowth itself, or the concept. I think what's really important is that whether one takes the degrowth movement here, or the solidarity economy, or the commons movement, or whether one takes Buen Vivir, Sumak Kause, etc. from South America, or Ubuntu from Southern Africa, or Swaraj and radical ecological democracy from India, is the search for a common set of principles and values. And I think that's something that's also valuable. I mean, there are elements of that in the book on degrowth, but we need to actually tease these out much more. We need the kind of dialogues amongst ourselves to do this. And of course, here I just put up an initial set, again based on things that we've learned from these local initiatives themselves, which to my mind is a set of values and principles that is diametrically opposed to, or in contradiction to, the values or the lack of values that our dominant economic and political system teaches us. Again, and I repeat here, whether it's capitalism or in fact whether it's state-led systems, it seems to me that this is in fact a set of values that emerges from putting that community, self-defined unit at the core. I'm not, again, we don't have the time to go into all of these values, but I think it's really crucial that we do this kind of a search and see what is emerging that is common, that can actually form a powerful narrative wherever these movements against growth and the current notion of development and for alternative paradigms is. Now, therefore, I think the need for this dialogue is really crucial, the need for building these up. The word degrowth itself, in that sense, we did, in fact, after the Leipzig conference last year, there was a degrowth conference in New Delhi, growth, degrowth, and post-growth. And I think one of the things that a lot of people did say is that the term itself, and the concept of the term, it's something that, and I think I agree with Amita here, is problematic for many reasons. Because, as she said very rightly, a lot of people are actually looking towards whether it's growth or development for improving their livelihoods and their lives, since there is significant deprivation even now. But I think perhaps that we need to actually, if we need to find, first of all, I don't think we need to necessarily find a common term. I think the diversity of terms where people are coming up with different paradigms itself is worth celebrating. But if we do need to find something that's common, then I would think that something like well-being or some such word may have greater resonance amongst different peoples of the world. It's not a negative term, it is a positive term, and it brings in much more than just material well-being, all kinds of other things that it takes to be a happy human being. And that in the process of searching for alternative paradigms of well-being, it is quite possible that we might be doing, a number of the initiatives that I talked about here may actually result in growth, but that would be, and Amita, maybe there's a little bit of difference here, maybe, I don't know, that would be an outcome, an accidental outcome of the primary goal and means which are of the kind that I've spoke about here. And that growth, therefore, is neither a means nor an object and a goal, which unfortunately it has become in India or elsewhere. And so we have to absolutely dethrone growth as an objective or as a means and say that, look, there are many different other ways by which human beings can achieve well-being, by which deprivation can be removed. Maybe some of these result in growth in some parts of the world. In other parts of the world, they have to mean degrowth. But growth itself is brutally dethroned from its current exalted status. So maybe there's basic agreement on that count, certainly from the visions or the concepts that are coming up from Indian communities and NGOs and so on, and what you've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 3 excellent presentations on a topic I'm personally very interested. My area is different, but I have been following the literature on degrowth or steady state growth. My question is related to population growth. What are your thoughts about that aspect? Because there are lots of debates. Population growth. Thanks.
2, 3 more.
Congratulations for the book, for all the presentations, and also, Amita, to bring the debate on the colonial critics that I've been talking to Giorgos about it. I think it's really inspired the points that you have raised. And it seems that the end of the book opens up the idea of maybe a new book on other possibilities, other ontologies, other visions, other meanings. And I come from a country, Brazil, that has in the flag the word progress. And anyone who tries to oppose progress in its own territory, it's seen as a barrier, as an obstacle that should be eliminated. And then comes, I have felt the same here in country and in other countries, like this, the idea of growth, of progress, of development, as one almost a theology of a meaning that it has to pursue, same as extraction, and then there is a multitude of other possibilities, other visions, other ontologies, such as it's mentioned in the book, such as you had brought from India. And I was wondering if not only naming the beast, but maybe, well, can we synthesize the critique on only capitalism, only on growth, or to accept the multitude of diversities actually that will trying to build other possibilities of living, of defending of lives. I don't know if I was clear, but it was to hear about this other possibilities of living in this planet at the end.
Hi, I'm here as a journalist, so my language is going to be a little different. And, growth and progress is sometimes used by politicians or economists as fulfilling a need. And environmentalists use sustainability as fulfilling need. So it seems like sometimes they're competing with one another. So my question, what I'm curious is, self-sustainability, is that the answer to growth, rather than using degrowth? Thank you. Self-sustainability, yeah.
Thank you very much for the three very interesting presentations. And I think it's really a problem of discussing the context in which each contribution might create, in a kind of a performative way, the conditions of its acceptance or rejection. By that I mean, it is important perhaps to compare the fact that the discourse on degrowth comes from the first world. It's true that it comes from there, but it creates in the first world what it is necessary to create now. That is, as you said, Ashish, in the end, it creates really a dethroning of the word growth. On a different context, the discussion of buen vivir comes in Latin America as a form of being on the side of the indigenous populations. So this is another kind of destroying the certainties and the beliefs of those societies which were based on the elimination of the differences of the indigenous people. So I'm not sure if it's easy to say if degrowth or buen vivir are terms to be used and they are good for any case in any kind of context. Indeed, there are terms that can sustain specific struggles in terms of theory and ideas in specific contexts. I think it is equally necessary to fight for a recognition of the values of buen vivir in Latin America, and then through that recognition put new questions to the context of the West, but also to fight inside the West through forms that might affect the very conditions that the West has built its own self-image. And I think the discourse on degrowth has this power. It should not, I think it should not replace any kind of anti-capitalist criticism. You're right on that, the first speaker, I mean. It should not. It does not exhaust the problem of changing to a more just and a more democratic and a more egalitarian society. It cannot be reduced to that. I think degrowth is a very powerful tool to speak in these conditions in the West, and perhaps we should kind of make this appraisal of its contribution in this kind of context. So I very much think that the three contributions could produce a ground of discussion without necessarily being contradictory or fighting against each other.
Let's have some answers, and then we will have a second round. Okay.
So I thank you both Amita and Ashish for your comments, and thanks for the questions. There is a lot in the plate, so I'll try to go a little bit quickly. So the first question was about capitalism, no? So why don't we just focus, okay, I simplified, sorry. I think Stavros put it much more in a way that I would agree. But one would be, is it redundant or criticism compared to existing criticism of capitalism? I think Stavros put it, no, it's not redundant, because there is a specific criticism to be made to growth per se. And sometimes when I try to throw slogans so that they are a little bit less theoretical and people can get what's the point I'm trying to express without the PowerPoint, I say that degrowth requires the end of capitalism, but the end of capitalism does not necessarily will bring the end of growth. And I have equal trouble of explaining degrowth to economists as I have to a lot of radical political economists or Marxists who are as much obsessed and driven by the ideology of growth as are neoclassical economists. So for us, I think the battle is dual. You know, it's like both to the right and to the left, to argue that growth has been a problematic idea, and we think that growth has been at the core of, I wouldn't say it's a main factor, but was at the core also of what has been wrong with existing attempts to overcome capitalism. So that's one. I think degrowth is adding something then on top of the critique to capitalism, but of course the critique to capitalism is central to degrowth. So if you see the keywords we had, the size was the frequency of the word appears in the text, and capitalism and the critique to capitalism was one keyword in our book, and then it was like, I think, the second or third largest word appearing in the book after growth itself. So it is central there, but I think we are adding something more. About the déjà vu, I think déjà vu is not bad per se. It can be bad if you're right and we are reproducing things, ideas that have been exhausted in the past or failed. But I think déjà vu per se is not bad. I was reading recently an excellent book about the Paris Commune, communal luxury, which had the ideas of the Paris Commune, and then when I read them, I said, oh, we are saying the same, you know, we are very similar to what people were saying. But of course, this is not accidental, because a lot of the writers that have influenced the growth through Paul Lafargue have come to French intellectuals, and then through them have come to us. So I don't find the problem per se with the same ideas, slightly different, reappearing in different times. What worries me, and we're trying to understand, is like why these ideas lost expediency in the 70s, because it's true. In the 70s, they were very strong. So you had like an acceptance of the criticism to growth, again, even from conservative circles, even from the President of the United States, etc., or the President of the Commission at the time. But you had the leader of the Communist Party in Italy talking also about the growth. You had the Greens in Germany coming out very strong with policies very similar to what we are arguing today. So it's true, it was a very strong thing happening there, not in these words, and it didn't take off. Why is an important question, and it's especially important if there were certain mistakes done rather than certain historical forces that they are impossible to control that we might need to know now. About colonialism, etc., I would say yes, I would agree with Stavros and Amita that it's a Eurocentric concept, or it's a concept that most of the people, no, all the people that we are writing about it, we are in the Euro-Americas and increasingly so in Latin America, but mostly in the Euro-Americas. And I would say that myself, I know very little about colonialism, about the literature. I haven't experienced any of that other than going for a wedding in India, which is not field work. So I personally feel very limited to write or say anything about it. Of course, I mean, we have to make an effort to write up to the point that we can claim something within the context that we operate, and this is where we are putting this argument. But let me say something else, though, that within Europe, the growth is coming from the south of Europe. which is like, it's not the global south, but it's the European south. So it's mostly come from France, then Italy, then Spain and Catalonia, then Greece. Now it's popular. So it's a southern discourse, but a different type of south. So I feel we are doing something there. And then I have to say that to the extent I understand the work of Serge Latouche, who is the main instigator of the idea of degrowth, the croissants in France, he wrote explicitly against, he was part of the circle of intellectuals talking about colonialism, and the way, and his entry, Decolonizing the Imaginary, in our book, is speaking about this circle of intellectuals, where I understand it from this very limited reading of 4 pages in our book and a few other things I've heard from Serge Latouche. He was saying that their criticism to colonialism was not just the power of colonialism, the military, the oppression, but also the ideas that colonialism brought. And for them, development and growth are central ideas of how colonialism sustains and continues itself. So I understand that there is a link there also with critiques of colonialism through Serge Latouche. And of course, people who want to develop that are more than welcome to contribute. So if decolonization or colonialism becomes a keyword, it will be in the next edition and would be an even more complete edition. Development is needed in India, etc., and growth a certain level. What we criticize with the growth is not the growth, you know, like, okay, I produce 100 today and I want to produce 150 tomorrow so that I have clean water. This of course might be needed, but growth is an idea that's very different from that, which says that every year produce 3% more than the previous year. So it's 103, 106.3, and up to infinity, you know. So it's a continuation of expansion. It's not something that has a limit and stops there. And I read a very nice paper by Gareth Dale, who was writing a critique to growth in a journal called Socialism, something. I mean, I don't remember the exact reference. But he said a very nice point. He said the demands of the political left were always about specifics. So the specifics are, we need clean water for the people who need clean water. We need sustainable livelihoods. We need a basic income, or we need a basic social security net. We don't need growth. This is the type of discourse we're trying to promote, if this makes it a little bit clearer. So I'm still reluctant to use the word growth of development even in other contexts, because I think then we're just perpetuating what we are trying to criticize. The other 2 questions, I think they were important, and I leave them open for discussion because I don't have your questions. Who does it leave out? Because I'm sure we leave out. There's no discourse that doesn't leave anyone out. Who does it speak for, etc., about Asia? So I think these are important questions to which I won't have an answer. From Ashish, I didn't get any criticism, so that was easier, so I won't respond. Population. With population, I think we're doing okay without putting any effort, so it's fine, because it seems that population is peaking. I mean, most predictions say that population is peaking at 9 billion. If you see the current tendencies in China, India, etc., the rates of reproduction have declined, so the projections are that population is going to peak. What we should be ready to confront is the rising discourses now that they say like that this is a problem. So we have to confront the discourse that this is a problem, because this is a problem just for capitalism, because it needs cheap labor. And this is what's happening in China and India right now. We had a nice presentation by Paul Robbins, a prominent political ecologist, who was saying what is happening is that there is slowing of population growth in rural China and urbanization, which raises the cost of labor in the rural areas, and this makes it difficult for the people who run the agricultural enterprises to make profit. And now what they do is they shift to fertilizers and pesticides. So in a way, like, reduction of population growth is bad for the environment, which is counterintuitive. But I think we need to engage with that, but I don't think it's the central focus right now. And of course, whenever we engage with that, and we do engage with population in the book, we engage with a point of view that where population is growing uncontrollably, the main problem there is gender equality and women empowerment. So that should couch it in these terms rather than in terms of population. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I mean, theology, growth as theology is an idea that Serge Latouche has developed a lot, and I fully agree. And we say, like, the growth is not to be against, no, it's to be atheist. But to be an atheist, you have to be an active atheist. It's not just, not to be like, I don't know about God, you know? It's like, I don't believe in God. So it's a metaphor that plays out a lot in the degrowth literature.
Yeah, just want to respond to a couple of points. One about what you said about maybe the idea of degrowth applies in certain contexts and may not make that much sense in another. That's true to a certain extent, and I suppose since degrowth, if not degrowth, at least a slowing down of economic growth is already happening in parts of Europe and in North America, one could say that in some ways the idea of degrowth is maybe making a virtue out of necessity, and that's good, and one can explore that further. But the question that then raises is, if capitalism is a global system and everything is connected, then one can't just follow a policy of degrowth for one part of the world. One has to see its implications for the rest as well. And I think the book does suggest how those connections might be made in terms of opening up ecological spaces or spaces for alternative ideas and so on. Second, just to respond to this point about the comparison with the 1970s, I didn't mean to suggest that because the ideas were there before, therefore, we don't need to engage with them. But more to the point that in that comparison, if we think about why the idea of development has persisted, I think there's a lesson for why the idea of growth may also persist in the present, and why perhaps degrowth may not catch on. I hope it does. And that's that if one looks at where the resistance to discarding the concept of development came from, it was not only just from the development machine, from aid agencies and governments and capitalist firms and so on, but there was, and there continues to be, widespread popular support for the idea of development. And in fact, this is something that Ashish and I have often, I think, argued about without necessarily coming to any resolution, which is that, Ashish, for all the people who are trying for the kinds of alternatives that you talk about and which also fit the model of degrowth that you discuss, I'm saying which fit the model of degrowth that you discuss. There's many, many, many more who actually want an option out of their present lives, who don't want to live sustainably and who don't want to live in the ways that you describe with ecological restraint and so on. They want to live well and they want to live a lot better. And one is just the politics of our saying, you shouldn't do this. Ashish sort of gets around that problem because he says, well, there's poor people who are saying that themselves. But I think the fact that people want to live better can't simply be dismissed as false consciousness. I mean, there is something there, and I think, in a way, for me, there's a visual image which is sort of which tellingly captures this. That there's Gandhi in his loincloth, and he's bare-chested, and he's very clearly representing a certain kind of austere personal ethic. And then there is B.R. Ambedkar, who the leader of the Dalits or the former untouchable castes in India. And wherever you see Ambedkar's statue, he's always dressed in a three-piece suit. Because wearing a three-piece suit to him and to the millions of Dalits who he represented is about a better life. It's about living with dignity in a world where for generations you've been denied that. So I think we need to think about the politics of who comes up with the idea of degrowth and who's willing to live by it, and with what consequences not only for themselves but for others as well.
Okay, thanks. I'll try and respond to a couple of points, other points that came up. One was the idea of self-sustainability, whether that's a response to an answer to growth or another term that could replace degrowth. Possibly, but I think the term sustainability has itself has become, it's open to use by virtually anybody. So right now, as you know, the countries of the world are negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals. By September, they should be having a 15-year bunch of targets on what they call sustainable development. There's sustainable growth, there's all kinds of things are used. And I think the problem there is that the word sustainability, unless you of course define it in the way that we're talking about here, lends itself to businesses saying, yeah, we want to be sustainable, which means we want to sustain our profits. And sustainable development, if you look at the current draft of the text that is being negotiated, is actually premised on continued global economic material growth. So there's a problem there in that sense. So maybe when you say self-sustainability, it could actually maybe go beyond that. But again, who is the self? I mean, so the issue, the politics of inequality and injustice, all of that needs to bring in. And I think the term sustainability, unfortunately, even when it was first defined or first brought up in the Brundtland report, didn't really focus very much on the issue of inequality and injustice, which I think it needed to, or now we need to do it. So I would say that, yeah, I mean, it's worth looking at, but we need to add to it and not leave it just at sustainability or even self-sustainability. On the notion of progress, yes, it's very clear actually that this is something that needs to be confronted. If the idea was that it's not just about capitalism, but it's actually either much further back in history or much deeper in our psyches, maybe even the notion of development, is that yes, there is something there which is kind of almost religious. And so therefore needs to be brought out and discussed. So what is progress? What is prosperity? What is wealth? These are all questions that I think need far greater dialogue and discussion, and to break down or to separate the notion that all of these have to do with money or finance or material wealth, etc. Is very crucial. So Tim Jackson in his book Prosperity Without Growth actually does that. He says prosperity doesn't necessarily have anything to do with money or finances or material wealth. So in that sense I agree that I think we need, and I personally think that a critique of growth and development being a critique only of capitalism is problematic also from this point of view, which is why I keep adding state-dominated systems, or I think what you said about your orthodox Marxist friends is also something that we have to bring in. Simply dealing with capitalism will not necessarily solve the problem. Yeah, Amita, I think maybe there's, well, one is of course lack of time. One has to go much deeper into these sorts of issues. I think what these communities, not just these but many others are saying, but still a minority, absolutely, is not that they want to live in poverty or that they want to live with the kind of simplicity that Gandhi might have been talking about. They do say that, no, we're deprived right now, we do want more. And we want much better human well-being, much better well-being for ourselves, for our children, which includes things like, schools and hospitals and so on and so forth. But when we discuss it in detail with them, it does not seem that they're saying we want growth in order to do that, or we want development in the way that state is talking about, or economists are talking about development to do that. What they're saying is, let us define what that means. Now, of course, there's a very large section of India's population, or the world's population, maybe the majority right now, which is saying that you guys have cars and you guys fly around in airplanes to go to Istanbul to talk about radical ecological democracy. We also want that. And I would absolutely be no one to say, no, you can't have that. But it's really about creating that dialogue within ourselves, first of all, and then also with people like that, saying, look, here are what we think are the implications of everybody wanting that. You read out Gandhiji's quote right in the beginning. Yeah. So what are the implications of it? Can we then sit together and say, okay, look, yes, there is more human well-being needed, but could it be a little different from the models that are otherwise, that the mainstream models that are available to us. Because otherwise what tends to happen is that we do say that, look, the majority want this and we are nobody to question it, but then the majority in India also are actually male chauvinists, but we do question that. The majority are also casteist and we do question that. So I think it's the questioning is not in terms of a judgmental thing, kind of saying you're wrong and we are right, but it's actually saying, look, here are what we think are the implications. Here are what we think is right or wrong, and let's discuss it, let's dialogue it. It's in that sense that I guess one would bring up the notions of what really is well-being, and whether the developmental model we have right now actually captures that or not. Let me just end by actually saying, giving the grays, the complexities of this whole discussion. Many of you might be aware that in South India there is an indigenous tribe that has actually thrown out or rejected mining, UK-based mining corporation, the Dongria Kond and the Vedanta Corporation. Amita, in fact, was part of a committee that looked at it. We've been going there in the last few months. The mining project has been rejected, so that victory has been won, at least for the moment. But at the same time, what we see there is that the state has already come in with its welfare schemes, which include things like mainstream education, mainstream health, roads, etc., all in the name of development and welfare of the Adivasis, the indigenous populations there. And that actually that is in very subtle but very clear ways undermining the knowledge systems, the worldviews, the cosmovisions, and the learning methods, the health practices, etc., of the Dongria Kond, the indigenous people themselves. And so it's absolutely, to my mind, urgent that one actually raises these issues. What really is development? Not in terms of saying this is wrong, that you should not have schools or should not have hospitals, etc., but in saying that, look, can we actually have an equal dialogue amongst those people who still have that traditional knowledge or local knowledge or whatever, and those from outside who say that this is what development is, and maybe evolve something which is an alternative, where the deprivation is reduced, but it's not done in ways that you actually completely destroy the identity and the culture of the community itself. So that's a real, and that probably there are thousands of such examples around the world. Certainly in India, that is a real life thing that we're facing right now. So I think it's absolutely urgent that we are able to get to some level of common understanding of what well-being would be. Whether we call it development or not can be something we can keep debating, but at least to say what well-being should be and what the different alternative notions coming up from around the world have to contribute to that discussion.
We can now collect 2-3 very brief questions, please. Okay, we are running out.
I want to stand against this idea that in the 70s, movements in Europe were self-centered. My experience is just the opposite. I haven't known any society that was as ready to question itself and to open itself to other culture than the Western culture at that time. And what I also noticed, it was the other cultures that took this fell into the trap in falling into self-complacency and, oh yeah, we're the victims and they're the bad guys, and they went down on their necks. And any argument that came from the West was, oh no, it's not pertinent. And in fact, most of them were pertinent, and they were rejected. Instead of learning something from that, they blew up the whole thing. I think it's not at all the Western world that can be held responsible. I think this is a really dangerous trap. And we're even experiencing this in Turkey right now, this sort of victim psychology, and everything that's against us, everything that criticizes us is, the West, these guys that are building up, I don't know what conspiracies against us, and it's a way of developing this complacency that takes you away from taking your responsibility and facing the problems in your own culture. And one blank example is the caste system. And I'm very happy to hear someone in India talk about the caste system instead of breaking our ears with colonialism, etc., things that we're all fed up with.
Thanks very much. I would like to ask you, you are talking about growth and all that, but who are you to impose such living and depressing condition on the producers and the nature for the myth of growth? What gives you the right to legitimize such desperate condition for the myth for growth? I'm simply asking, as at the end of your talk, you were talking about philosophical side who decides right and wrong on all that side. And I'm basically asking, who are those, like who are you to decide or who are you to impose such living and depressing condition on the producers, laborers or peasants, and the nature the people are living around for the myth of growth, for the sake of the growth, or for the sake of development?
One last question.
Thank you for all your presentations. My question is for the first presenter, and a question about the vocabulary, actually. So do you think that your vocabulary you propose here actually has the power to transform the current political system in which that the rich has many and the poor has nothing? By rich, I mean that the governments, the business, the multinational companies, people who have the power, the vast amount of resources, capital, media, military, and the police forces, and the other means to not let happen that your vocabulary actually change the system. So my question is actually, do you think that a new vocabulary shouldn't be more about that anti-capitalism, anti-such institutions, anti-militarization, and anti-growth, not degrowth? Thank you.
I mean, I don't think we are anyone other than some academics speaking here, no? Yeah, so I think when we don't have so much power as academics. I think what we're trying is to start new discussions and conversations. So like to say, who are we to impose on people that they will live on degrowth? I mean, we are far, far from having any power to impose the degrowth. And I mean, even the way we wrote the book was precisely open to say that there's no single idea here, there's no recipe, there's no something. Like, I mean, the next option to that is to stop writing and stop being academics, but then it will be a little bit of waste of years, money from my parents, all these things. So, like, I'm trying to make some use of what they did, you know, and I think that's what you're doing to studying and being an academic. You want to create some new conversations. I don't think you're doing it because you want to impose your vision on the rest of the world. And I think you don't want to impose your vision because you have to be very little confident about it. So I don't think we are confident with degrowth, and that's why we wrote it as a vocabulary. I mean, we might be more confident and try to write a manifesto, but again, even a manifesto which sounds like, okay, I know what should happen, I think it's also the way you present it. Either you deposit it as a strong opinion to kick a debate, or you impose it because you pretend that you know what should be done. If you do the latter knowledgeably, I wouldn't be with you, because at least my feeling is that I don't know what should be done, you know, and the little I understand, it's really complicated to understand what's happening, you know. If you try to understand the economy, try to understand the materialization of these things. So to say that you know what should be done, it's wrong. But you have a position on what could be done. And Cornelius Castoriadis, who's a philosopher, called this doxa, you know. It's like your personal doxa. You don't say the world works like this, but you say, okay, given what I know, I have a strong opinion and I defend it that things could go this way. And then maybe you're wrong, etc. Yes, I think we're trying to create a vocabulary not for the multinationals or for the military complex to take it and read it and say, oh, conviviality, that sounds good, you know. I mean, I'm joking, but this is far from the ideal. The ideal is to create a vocabulary for people like us or for people who are in social movements and they are trying to say something new. So trying to create a vocabulary that can express this something new in different ways than they were expressing it before and could be problematic. So to the extent, I'm saying again that I think in Barcelona, not because of us, but because we are part of the circle of Barcelona, you know, we are part of it and we took the words from them and we gave them back and it's a circulation of ideas. These ideas are taking also political hold. This gives me some hope. Now, of course, there are many more things to be done other than writing a vocabulary, you know. So, of course, now the new authorities of Barcelona, they're going to start having classes with a mafia interest that they are moving the port of the city, etc. I don't think the vocabulary will save them there. But it played its role also, or it was product of the place where we lived, and I think that was something important to do.
Okay, nothing much more to add. I think just on the notion, on the vocabulary stuff, it seems to me that I think our movements or whatever we're trying to do as academics, activists, practitioners, whatever we are, I think it's a very, very important process to try and reclaim words, because all of the words that we might be using, I mean, civil society has been producing new words, creating them, etc., and then often they get hijacked, or there are older words which are being currently used or misused in different ways. I spoke about sustainability as one of them. Certainly in our context, for instance, the word tradition, or you take the word radical, or you take the word school, or any of them, actually if you look back at the origins of some of these words, it's fascinating to do that, because you realize that in fact the way they're being used now is completely different from, often opposite of what it used to be. The word school, as an example, I think used to be, the original Latin, if I'm not mistaken, was about time of leisure, where children were sitting around with adults and learning like that. It wasn't the kind of schools that we have now, which are prisons, at least in India. I think vocabularies actually are important, very important in terms of creating the political and social climate for change, and especially to try and reclaim what has been hijacked by those who want the current systems of power to continue. Anyway, I just wanted to add that. And also to say that a little bit of publicity here, there's a 20-page booklet, which is, nobody reads 400 pages, right? So I don't know why we wrote this book. But there is a 20-page extreme summary of it, and if somebody people want it, then I'd be happy to give you a copy. Thank you.
I also just want to end with a small clarification in case that's necessary. The fact that ideas emerged in Europe or somewhere else, I don't think the point of origin necessarily means that they're inherently contaminated. I mean, that would be a stupid thing to think. The fact that I'm here speaking in English and using a conceptual vocabulary that all of us share shows, the fact that I work within a knowledge system which is very much shared here. I think the point I'm trying to make is that we need to be much more conscious about the politics of knowledge. Not in terms of who produces what alone, I mean the genealogy matters, but the work that ideas do, and the ways in which meanings get mobilized around certain concepts. And I think a clarity towards that only comes from the kind of conversation that we've been having, because whether we call it capitalism or growth, I mean, these have implications in terms of a strategy, in terms of what one decides to focus on and what one doesn't. So I think it's important to take words seriously, because these are important words and they have been with us for a long time and they will be again. And to recognize that the words are plural, they're polysemic, they mean different things to different people, and one can't just dismiss that, but one has to in some ways work with that. Thank you.
So I would like to thank all three speakers. And for those who are interested, tomorrow we have a discussion on eco-socialism and green politics in the UK with Pat Levine and Derek Wall. So this will be from 10 to 1 in every Ibrahim Bodur building. And I would like to really thanks once again for accepting being here and spending all these 2 hours with us, both to the speakers and the